Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Today, we are talking about a transition assessment. Does your child need one? When does he need one? And what should that assessment look like? Who better to talk about the subject than Dr. Gwen Palafox? Dr. Gwen is a fierce ally of neurodiverse and disabled students and has supported their wonderful families and support systems for over 25 years. She's a clinical psychologist who is laser focused about empowering through reliable knowledge, creativity, and skill building. I'm absolutely thrilled that she's here today.
Millions of kids struggle with learning, processing, and social emotional difficulties. These challenges interfere with their ability to reach their full potential. Dr. Karen Wilson is here to help. Her extensive background in pediatric neuropsychology and higher education have prepared her for this unique mission. Listen as she delivers content to inform, educate, and empower parents and educators. This will enable you to identify challenges that kids face and get them on the road to achieving their full potential. This is Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus.
Hello, Dr. Gwen.
Hello, Dr. Karen. How are you?
I'm doing so great. It's so, like I said, there's some people when I see on my calendar, I get really excited about, and you are one of those people.
Well, back at you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for being here. You know, I know you've been on the podcast before, and I've always said I've got to have her come back because, you know, our conversation, I felt like there's so much more we could say and do. And now we're at that point in time. It's January, we're recording this. Parents and students are thinking about transition out of high school. It's going to be in a few months. Seems like a few weeks. And parents are already thinking about, you know, what comes next? What is the next step? And, you know, I love it when parents are thinking about this in 10th grade as opposed to 12th grade in terms of what comes next. But that what's next looks so different for neurodivergent, disabled students and their families within those families. And that's why I wanted to have you on here, because there's so many questions about, do I need a transition assessment? What should that look like? What is next for my child? And there's so much to unpack, right?
Yeah.
And you and I have talked about transition assessments, transition before, the process of transition, but you are the perfect person for me to talk to about what is a transition assessment, who needs it, and what should it look like? So that's a lot.
Yeah, that's a lot to unpack. I mean, I think let's start let's take like a drone's eye view on transition first, right? It's drone's eye now, not bird's eye, because, you know, I'm so relevant. I'm so kidding. Anyway, you know, transition, the idea of transition is change, right? And that change is not something that, especially when we're talking about development, is abrupt, right? It is a gradual progression to something. And I think the first thing when we think about transition is what are we transitioning to? So that I think is a really actually very complicated kind of question. But, you know, when should transition planning start? I ideally would love to see transition planning start when high school starts. You know, as a freshman, you know, high school flies by. It's a blink, right? But the skills that we want to be thinking about in transition are not really measured at school necessarily, right? So, for example, your grades. You know, we focus on grades a lot. The reality is many of the people that I work with and the families that I support, their kiddos or their teenagers are probably not going to be doing or taking a traditional 4-year collegiate path. And some do. And if that's the case, and you know that the typical 4-year traditional collegiate path, degreed outcome, yeah, grades are important, right? And I would even go on to say, from a college readiness perspective, we really want to look at other kinds of skills that lead to college readiness. But we know like a successful student needs to have at least, a 10th grade reading, writing, decoding, fluency, comprehension, or higher unremediated. We want to be able to see someone be able to know themselves, ask for help, and then utilize the help that they've actually asked for. So there's all these pieces, but I think what gets caught up sometimes is where are we going? And that is actually, I think, what paralyzes parents. Because it's like, I don't know, right? And in order for us to know that, really, we got to go back to adaptive skills, in my mind, right? The adaptive skills of what does it take to live as an autonomous, fully independent adult. That is actually the measure in which you want to measure against. Because when you measure against a fully functioning, independent, autonomous adult, it becomes really clear where your kiddo is going to need support, interventions, or services, right? A lot of times we'll say, well, that's not an appropriate outcome or litmus test or something for us to measure, against or to. But the reality is we do need to have that idea because that's what the neuromajority or the world is working like, right? So, so for me, when we look and use that as the gauge, then it brings us back to who is our kid today?
Right.
Right?
Right. And who they are today might be different than who they are by the time they get to 12th grade.
Right. Which is why transition planning needs to happen at least yearly starting in the freshman year. That is, I feel really strongly about that. I think the best outcomes come when we think about transition planning earlier. And, most people that have kids that are supported by an IEP don't know that it is the law to have an ITP, an individualized transition plan, the year that the student turns 16. I can't tell you how many people I've supported that are seniors, and they're like, "What's an ITP?" And I said, "You have an ITP in your ITP and your IEP, right?" I don't know what an ITP is. So how much we don't know? It's like that ITP is the vision of your entire IEP because it's all about goals or post-secondary goals and how the IEP goals are supporting those post-secondary goals. So I feel like that just kind of legal piece or that rights piece or that awareness piece is so critical for parents to know. But regardless, transition planning really needs to start earlier. And it's because usually this neurodiverse community takes longer. They need more support and they need, I say this a lot, is longer runway, softer landings. They need that longer runway and they need those softer landings to launch. And whatever launching means for that particular individual, but it does bring us back to how are we measuring and really thinking about who our kid is qualitatively and quantitatively today? And how does that measure up on our vision for our kid when they're done with high school?
Right. And everything that you've just said indicates and suggests and should be a red flag for parents is that this assessment should involve and needs to involve more than just where your child is academically. Because I think from elementary through, preparing for high school, the focus is on these educational goals, reading goals and writing goals and math goals. But we need to kind of step back and get a broader picture of how do we prepare this young person for adulthood beginning now in 9th grade? What are the things that we need to do to put in place to support them? Or what skills do we need to develop beyond academic skills to prepare them for independent living, if that's the goal?
Oh, yeah. I mean, in my mind, academic skills actually, when I do a comprehensive transition assessment, academic skills are probably the least weighted in the way that I conceptually present a student. the top, I would say the top skills to really be thinking about would be social emotional learning skills across the 5 competencies of SEL. So we've got self-awareness, right? Self-management, social awareness, right? Social skills and responsible decision-making. And really, self-awareness, if I had to choose one of the 5 competencies, self-awareness is the key kind of linchpin foundation for everything else. But how much support does our population, our community need to help self-reflect, to help put symbols and words to who they are? I mean, they're still young, right? I mean, they're forming their own identities as well. I mean, that's the natural kind of responsibility of this age group through adolescence. However, there needs to a lot of times be, I think, more framework, more structure, which, is easily handled, I think, in psych or even speech therapy. How do I talk about myself? Many people talk about, the Michelle Garcia Winner, Knowing Me, Knowing You kind of curriculum. And I'm like, let's get to just knowing me. Like, we don't even know me yet, And so how do we facilitate that? So that skill, those competencies would be like one hill that I would absolutely like die on. And if I could choose to split my body and die on another hill, it would be, all the executive functioning kinds of skills. And what I mean by that, like, I think executive functioning, oftentimes when we hear that phrase, we think, oh, it's like goal setting and like planning and finishing homework, right? When the reality, in my mind, executive functioning is really about how do I manage my frustration in the midst of distress or demands? How do I prioritize? How do I bring my attention and sustain my attention on things that are hard for me to do, right? This is really, I think, the real function, like the functional aspects, the practical aspects of executive functioning more than the completion of homework. It's like, if I can't stay regulated and I can't like kind of hang on to a longer term, not immediate goal and kind of plug away at a goal that's a little bit beyond me, one that I can't see right away, one I can't feel right away, that I think is kind of the heart, bringing my conscious awareness and attention to that task. That's really where I feel the challenge is. But when you've got, solid SEL, social emotional learning, solid executive functioning, or at least, growing emergent skills, and we're focusing on, I guess, the processes, not the outcome, but the process in which I live in this world and face demands in this world. That is where I feel we get a lot of nice kind of post-secondary results, right? Because I can bring that process to anything in my life, whether it's class, whether it's work, whether it's friends and social. But, those would be some of the process-oriented kinds of skills I'd really be encouraging families and young people to be thinking about, with the very concrete skills of probably self-care, money, and transportation as being, quite close in regards to what is an independent or a more independent, teenager or adolescent look like.
Right. And when you're talking about kind of the self-awareness and even self-reflection, it also made me think about that leap to self-management, because you have to be aware of where you are, what you're able to do, and then also recognize your ability to self-manage. And the emotional regulation piece is a part of that. But also, how do you manage, if you have to make your own doctor's appointment, how do you not only make the appointment yourself, but keep the appointment? How do you follow up on the recommendations? Like, when are you able to do that on your own? And that also is, when you assess for that, then you also know where the support is needed and how do you build those skills, particularly if the assessment occurs earlier. Those are life skills. I mean, they require a significant amount of executive functioning, but it's the application of those executive functioning skills to real life experiences.
Yeah. And it skills are only built through experience. They cannot be built in any other way except for experience, which means that meaningful opportunities need to be regularly presented for practice to occur. Okay. So that can apply to anything. And this is why it's important actually to do a transition assessment in the freshman year, sometimes if not sooner, in regards to, we can always be working on social emotional learning. We can always be working on executive functioning skills by supporting the person to do and rely on themselves, right? That's another thing that I see like throughout high school. I mean, if a student comes to me and they have a one-on-one aid and they've had a one-on-one aid forever, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. My question though is always like, how are you replacing that one-on-one aid with a tool? What tool is that one-on-one aid using to replace themselves with? So that when they're gone, that tool stays with that person, that tool stays with that student. I will say 10 out of 10 times, no one's ever thought about that. They're just kind of in the mode of like, I need a one-on-one and this is how we're going to access the curriculum. But the one-on-one in essence is the SEL executive functioning proxy. And it's exactly the skills that need to be learned. And so then the one-on-one, you get to post-secondary life, and getting a one-on-one is really challenging, right? Getting a one-on-one funded after you leave district funding becomes very challenging. Even if you have, like we're in the state of California, even if you have regional center support, just think about the employment shortage that we're experiencing right now. There's plenty of work to be done. There's plenty of need, not enough people to fill that role. And there's other systemic reasons for that, which, is not part of this podcast. But, but we're not thinking like we want to be really intentional. Going through high school isn't just, moving from the freshman year to the sophomore year to the junior year to the senior year, right? It's really like, ooh, this really should be preparing my kid for adult living. What does that look like? And what is going to be important? We have the most failure to thrive at the collegiate level than we've ever had, with the most amount of dropping out of college and returning back home in our history. And we just have to ask ourselves, like, why? If I don't have emotional skills, and I'm not just talking about our neurodiverse community, I'm talking about society at large, right? If I don't have the social emotional skills and the planning skills to support myself and rely on myself, you can still ask for help, obviously, but where I feel self-reliant, it's not a surprise then that we're anxious about life and overwhelmed, because now it's not only the higher rigor of the academic demands, it's really more about, oh my gosh, how do I take care of myself in this space without any net? Right? So I just, so this is really, I think, such an important thing that we're missing, which is how are we preparing our young people to be ready to be adults?
Right. And so what you've established is that a transition assessment is not a psychoed assessment. It involves much more. So what should a good comprehensive transition assessment look like? So parents know that this is what my child needs. This is what I need to know how to prepare for these next steps and to support my child as they transition to adulthood. What should that look like, that transition assessment?
Yep. Okay. I love that you differentiated a transition assessment from a psychoeducational assessment. They're very different types of assessment, even though in my transition assessment, I rely on very good psychoeducational diagnostics, because while I was poo-pooing, academic functioning earlier, I do consider it in regards to what environments might be appropriate post-secondary in a student's post-secondary life. And I do really want to look at the cognitive kind of framework and structure that someone's coming to the world with. In other words, what kind of demands can I handle, right? So anyway, so let's go back to the components, I think, of a good transition assessment. As a disclaimer, I'm not a vocational rehab person, right? I am a licensed psychologist. And so when I started doing transition assessments, I looked at what was how to write a compliant, obviously, transition assessment, one that's competent and compliant. But I really felt like they were still too narrow. And I just couldn't help myself because I come from this history, this place of comprehensive psychodiagnostic evaluation. So I really took that kind of background and training that I had done, and I applied it to this framework. So let's just break down what the three main areas of transition. Transition assessments must always include evaluation in three main areas of learning, living, and working. If we think about the three main areas of life, adult life, they can fall under those three areas. Learning, so I'll say it again, learning, living, and working. A student must be, if they're getting a transition assessment, must be evaluated in those three areas, right? The funny thing about transition assessments is in an ITP, the living skills goals are not mandatory. They're optional. And they're optional if data says you don't need to write a living skills or a living goal, a postsecondary living goal, which I think is the dumbest thing one of the dumbest things I've ever experienced, because the bulk of a transition assessment is on adaptive living skills. Right? And we're not going to do that. It blows my mind. Anyway, whatever. Okay. So we've now got that framework, right? So actual skills need to be evaluated. And for me, because I'm not voc rehab, my transition assessments aren't going to tell you what career you should go into or what school you should go to. But I will tell you, do you have the learning to learn skills for a post-secondary environment, right? Can you take notes? Can you pay attention? Can you ask for help? Can you access your resources? Can you navigate your campus? That's what we might be looking at for learning. How about working? Well, I'm not going to tell you what job to get, but I can tell you if you have basic job skills. Can you get somewhere on time? Can you show up in a clean, with clean clothing? Can you take feedback from your supervisor productively? Can you work on a task by yourself and finish it? Right? That's what we're looking at. And then the living skills, really usually an adaptive skills assessment, like an ABAS, like an adaptive behavior assessment, usually something like that, or a Vineland is used for those. But the reality is it's not specific enough. I want to know how you use money. I want to know if you can transport yourself. I want to know if what your hygiene looks like. I want to know, if you can wash dishes, if you can maintain your home, if you can engage in leisure activities. We want to get a very specific kind of audit, actually, of adult living skills. So that's just base. And then I think that's the quantitative. I have air quotes up for those of you who are listening. Oh, you guys are all listening. We're not video. But I think where we lose sight of the data is we also don't paint a qualitative picture of who this person is today. And so in my transition assessments, I want to capture how someone describes themselves, how someone describes them. What are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? What are their triggers for distress? What conditions do they thrive in? What do they love? What are their preferences in regards to the environments that they want to be in? That to me is really the color of the assessment. Because when someone reads that, I want someone to be like, I know this person. And guess what? We can't put them in that program. It doesn't matter what that they have no adaptive skills right now, right? But they're not going to also fit in that program because relationships are first and foremost to them, and they're not going to be able to form relationships in that program, right? So I think good transition assessments capture the qualitative aspects, qualities of that person today, clearly define and show the skills they have in the working, learning, and living areas of life. And then, as a recommendations, connect the actual activities in the educational and the community settings, right, to bridging what that goal is. So in my recommendation section, in my assessment, I make it look like an ITP. And I make it look like an ITP so that the friction to acquiring the results of the assessment are funneled right into the tool that is being used educationally and legally to support the student, right? It is literally cut and paste, right? It's like, here's this proposed goal I have, and have based on this. And here are the bespoke activities that can be done at school and in the community. And what community resources need to be navigated, coordinated now. If you're a regional center client in the state of California, your regional center caseworker should be going to any of your IEPs that have an ITP. Full stop. I feel really strongly about that. As well as, don't underestimate the importance of your exit IEP. People are like, woo, cupcakes and balloons, we're done. And I'm like, that just became your legal document to funnel you and usher you right into your next legal support, from a funding perspective and support perspective anyway, if you're a regional center client. And if you don't have any of your documented how much support this student needs, that's the IEP that's being used, right? So how do we really think about this? But I think good transition assessments qualitatively paint a beautiful picture of who this person is today. We get a good sense of their actual skills in the working, learning, living areas, and it connects to very good activities, practical activities that also connect to community resources.
And it seems that with the goal in mind of what comes next after high school, that the process that you've described has to be collaborative with the student, because we have to know what is the young person's interests and dreams for their own future. If they have the strong academics and the ability to have a 4-year post-secondary degree, do they even want to go to college? What kind of work do they want to do? So bringing them into the process, this collaborative process of assessment, is such an important piece that often gets overlooked, because I think that parents often make decisions for their kids as they're doing the IEP meetings. But this is such an important piece of preparing for adulthood that they have to be involved in this process in a bigger way than they were when they were in second and third grade.
100%. The disability warring cry of nothing about us without us is woven into transition assessments. I mean, when I'm talking to families about dreams and fears of the future, and who are you and what are your strengths, I always ask the student, and there's always a student response. And if there's not a student response, it wasn't because I didn't attempt. Right? It's because they might be unable to answer a question like that right now, right? But did we try? Did we use every type of communication, language support that we know to be helpful, right? But the voice must be amplified, and that if we really want adolescents to have a sense of autonomy and agency. The other way that I hear about this is, I wish they were more motivated. And it's like, you're not motivated to make your own decisions and to be involved in your own decisions if you were never given the actual opportunities to be involved. And, some parents will say, well, my kid will get completely overwhelmed by those questions, right? To which my response is, what is the dose of demand that they will be able to digest? That's where you start. But you don't say no. Even if it's they're with you observing what you're doing, but you never do something for your adolescent without them. Medication management. We can name it all. But this is more of a relational, this is more of a rubber meets the road, relational piece of what's happening. But transition, much like all development, is a dynamic and interactive process between a parent and their child, and that parents, even through adolescence, continue to be the greatest influencer. And I really wish, we could bring the idea of an influencer. Parents, teachers, they still continue to be the greatest influencers, even though our adolescent children may not want anything to do with us, right? I'm a teenager. I know, right? But that doesn't mean that we don't presume their competence to be involved in this process.
And that's such an important piece, is to presume competence, right? And the other thing is that, you're gathering a lot of information during the process of this assessment. And this kind of ties to what we talked about earlier, is that the knowledge that you get from an assessment is not enough. It's good information. But we want is for that student to have the tools they need to live fulfilling lives. So what do we do with the assessment we gather? And how do we use that to prepare them for this autonomous living, to live those meaningful and fulfilling lives? That's the purpose of doing this, is it not?
Agreed. The most, this is where I think as psychologists, this is where our expertise falls, right? It's really in how did we put all the information together in a meaningful way that's going to result in empowerment, right? Because we've now done our due diligence in understanding what's happening, and we understand where they're going, or what the referral question, what we call a referral question. But I think too the onus of this can also fall. It's like on many people, as a psychologist or as an assessor, like make really specific recommendations that are actionable and practical. Like that's the first thing, right? Like don't make a recommendation that is not accessible. So that's like one of the first things. Or I would really put a disclaimer, but I always try to add something that a parent can do immediately in every section of learning, living, and working, as well as the school, right? The other piece, of doing it is that parents then also need to actually follow the recommendations. So I'm not, this is not me like blaming anyone. I'm just saying that it's oftentimes where you've a really nice set of recommendations, but none of them are followed because maybe a parent might be overwhelmed by a 45-page assessment, which has a lot of information. And if that's the case, then the answer there is not blame, it's support. Then that parent and that family probably need more support to access those recommendations. So oftentimes, like I think, I'm of the assumption that people really, really have good intentions and are trying to do their best. And so, if they're not doing it, it's probably more about support or environment or something like that we need to uncover as a barrier so that the support is actually, used or the recommendations are actually followed. But you're absolutely right. I mean, there's nothing worse, right, than a really comprehensive kind of evaluation that took a lot of resources and we don't really have a movement of the needle in a meaningful way. Yeah, agreed.
Right, because that's the goal. The plan is not to just say, well, this is where the weaknesses are. These are what the challenges the student is facing currently. It's not enough to say that's not even enough to identify strengths of that student. We have to have a plan to prepare them for the next step.
Yeah. Yeah. And what is that? There's that phrase, something along the lines of like, what gets measured gets modified, or like, it's like along those lines, like, paying attention to it and having attention to it is necessary in order for you to know, oh, now I got to go. So sometimes we also need to make paying attention to it a priority by putting it in our schedules, right? So those are just more practical aspects of coordinating. And, I don't think we should underestimate how overwhelming assessment and assessment results can be for families. So
absolutely. And it really speaks to the idea that it's not only the student who may be in need of support in terms of planning for, if they do it in ninth grade, planning over the next 4 years, but the family may be in need of support and guidance in terms of how to support their young person through this transition as well.
Oh, yeah. Because, honestly, like, do you know as a parent, like the 5 areas of safety? Like, just right off the bat, right? I know them because I wrote an inventory on it. You know what I mean? But that took me 10 years of cumulative attention on like, oh, I don't like that. Oh, I like that. Oh, I don't like that. I mean, it's totally criterion referenced, but, what gets managed, what gets measured gets managed. That's it. Sorry, that was a little delay of the processing speed.
But we got it. You got it.
We got there. But yeah, I mean, overwhelm, in stress responses, it's just another thing that I tend to look at as well. It's important, how we respond to stress, even as parents, which our kids tend to be our greatest sources of stress because we care so dang much about them. We got to also know our own profiles because, environments have the potential to support and encourage, but also to suppress and oppress. So as parents, we're part of that too,
Absolutely. Dr. Gwen, I love the work that you do. And I love Karen. The way that you champion our neurodiverse and disabled students. You're all about empowering neurodivergence and disabled individuals transition and really helping them achieve these sustainable, joyful, and fulfilling experiences as adults. So thank you so much for the work that you do. What is the best way for listeners to connect with you to learn more about transition assessments and support for the transition process?
Okay. So my website, which is www.meaningfulgrowth.com. I, as well as Karen, have my own socials, but where I probably post the most all of like the resources that I want to share with our community is on my YouTube channel, which is at Dr. Gwen Empowered. And on there, you can find, I've got explainer videos of what an IEP and what an ITP is. I created those because, of the questions that I've been asked. But I'm also doing, interviews with wonderful professionals. Dr. Karen's been on my podcast as well. But that's really a good place to get a lot of information, or if you want to learn more about me. But you can also reach out to me through my website. But yeah, those are the best ways to get a hold of me or see what I'm doing.
Wonderful. And I will put links to those in the show notes. Dr. Gwen, thanks again for being here and for sharing such great information with our listeners.
Thanks, Karen, for having me and having this platform.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode. It was such a great conversation with Dr. Gwen, and I hope you got some really great takeaways. You can connect with her by reaching out to her on her website. That information is in the show notes. And you can also connect with her on the Child Nexus platform. She is one of our Child Nexus professionals. So you can search for a provider, put in her name, and voila. Thank you so much for listening. I appreciate you. Until next time.
Thanks for listening to Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus. For more resources, visit us online at childnexus.com.